Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Braxton Kirsting. I'm the application expert here in Kansas City, Missouri. And today we're going to be investigating the actual cost we can maybe associate to working without a product data management solution. And so we're going to be comparing Windows Explorer to SOLIDWORKS PDM. And so where do we spend our time when we are talking about navigating our file system or our file structure? Well, the most common thing we hear is searching, actually finding the files that you need to use that you've already worked on. Another thing we hear is permissions. So with Windows permissions, we're a little bit lacking versus what we have to offer with PDM. And that does come with some costs attached to it. And then lastly, the file referencing. Another big one for File Explorer. There's nothing to really track where a part moves to or is renamed to from the perspective of an assembly or drawing. Let's dig right into it. We're tasked with the new design, and we really just need a shaft. This shaft component we worked on maybe a few months ago, a year ago, but we can't really remember where it was stored, what file name it has, or what folder it exists in, but we know it exists. And so we might, at this point, go to our File Explorer and find our file share. So here I have my engineering file share. And if I just do a standard search on, say, shaft, whoa. Now I'm looking at 100 results. So how do I narrow this down? Well, in File Explorer, this can be a bit limiting, right? We can, look for maybe a folder name in combination with the file name. So we see here, it's highlighting those folder names with assemblies in them. And so, with that, I've narrowed it down to 58 results. But sifting through these and really finding what we're looking for is going to be a bit troublesome, right? I might select the part, turn on my preview pane so I can see the thumbnail image, but the downside of a shaft, it's pretty common, right? The sizes the diameters may be different, but the actual shape and form of it is pretty similar across the board. So with all those results, what we end up doing is opening the file, viewing the dimensions, maybe checking out the file properties, and confirming this is the file we're truly after. Now, maybe we have some other identifying information, right? We have the material. Maybe we know the diameter we're looking for. Maybe a finish will help us narrow down our results. So these are all properties that we can store in a SOLIDWORKS files. Think about your drawing title block, right? These properties are typically coming from the model. So again, we may return to our search and okay, let's narrow it down to 4130. No results. Well, when we look at these SOLIDWORKS files in File Explorer, we aren't able to actually search on the file properties. Notice here there's not even a custom tab. So that tends to show up if the files are indexed, but it doesn't always show up from the client computer. So if we're just a regular user, we're not working directly in the file share. We're working out of a connection to that shared folder. And so we don't necessarily have access to that, which means we can't search on any of it. What you may have not known is that we can turn on some custom columns. So things like, description, if there is a description associated with the part, we can turn on this column. Now there are two. I don't necessarily know which one may have values. And we're actually seeing that we don't have any values showing up for this description column. So it's not reliable. It's limited to really just description. We can't search on a part number or material. But what does that look like in PDM? So we've already spent a couple minutes searching for this shaft. and we're still coming up empty. We're going to have to put more work in opening those files, investigating the properties, and verifying that's the right one. Well, in PDM, we have a couple different search options. The first one I'm going to look at is the quick search. So the quick search mimics what we used just now in the Windows File Explorer. Now I've gone ahead and added some of my common fields or variables that I search on. So description, material, finish happen to be all attributes that I know about the shaft that I'm looking for. And so the great thing about this is we can set this to search all variables and configurations. All right, so let's say I have a shaft. Oh, look, I even have a recent search for this. So I can combine somewhat more complex queries into this quick search. So I'm searching shaft, and it also has to have a value of 4130. Now, it's not specific to which one variable. It's just saying, hey, it exists in some of them. Now, I can launch the complete search, and this is a more involved search, but it allows us to build very complex queries. So I know the name of my file, or I'm looking for a shaft, and this would be the file name. Now, even if we didn't have that information, we have information such as the diameter, the material, and so the great thing about that is I can combine these into a single search. And so we have, file name, description, part number. We can also use the data cards that we've associated to these particular file types. So here we have my file cards. We have the Acme file card for my assemblies, drawings, and parts. And so my description, I know I need a 1-inch. Maybe there's a 1-inch in the description. We'll see. I know the material is 4130, and I know that I have a chrome finish. When we search that, it's almost instantaneous. We get one singular result, which is great. We're able to find that part immediately. But we can also take advantage of other PDM functionality, such as the preview, to further verify that this is the component we're looking for. And so let me make my view a little bit bigger. This is a full integrated eDrawings preview, so it is three-dimensional. I can rotate the part around, and I can even take measurements. So for instance, what is the diameter of this arc? And we see this is truly 1 inch. If I look at the data card, I can confirm the search values that I looked up. And it does happen to have the 1-inch diameter in the description. Now, if it didn't, of course, we could use that preview to verify. Let's use things like the where used and see which assembly uses the shaft. That might remind us where it was used, and also make us realize that this is the part we're looking for. Now, how many of you have found maybe the file you're looking for, but you found multiple of the same file? Now, outside of PDM, it's pretty common that I'll see people make copies of the files. Maybe you do a pack and go, and you update the file names to match the revision you're at. Well, then someone decides that they need a copy of it. They don't want to work out of your directory, and so they make another RevB. At this point in time, we might say, okay, let's look at the modified date. Maybe that will give us some clues. And so we see both RevBs have different modification dates. So now it becomes a question of which is the correct one. How much time do we have to spend to verify that? We have to go look up any references that use it, which is kind of hard outside of PDM. And so now we're stuck in this limbo of being unsure about the file that we're going to use and verifying if it is the right one. Now in PDM, we get a detailed file history. So if I look up that shaft part, I'll see the history, or if I look up the MLC 00123 part based on that part number, return to my handy search here, look up the MLC 00123 component, and with PDM, we've limited the entire history of revision A, revision B into a single file. We're not making copies of them anymore. Less files to manage, Maybe less storage space created if you're creating extra revisions for easier tracking. But in PDM, we have this detailed file history. And so we can see the changes, and I even made some comments here as I made through these changes where we go from Rev A to Rev B, and it's all in a singular file. And we can set the default behavior to always work with this latest version. And so now it doesn't become a question of what is the latest. We have the entire history in a single file. So what do we see with the searching in this comparison? Well, Windows search can be slower, especially if you're working over a slower network or you have thousands upon files. If you're searching a kind of higher up in a root directory, it can take some time to return those results. We also have somewhat limited visibility into those files, right? We don't have the properties visible. We can turn on description, but that doesn't really always work, and maybe doesn't have all the information we need. So we end up opening the files and putting extra effort into verifying. We also find that we might have duplicates based on different user behavior, or maybe even just how you manage your revisions. Now with the PDM search, it's going to tend to be faster because really what it's doing is querying a SQL database. So it's just looking through a bunch of tables and finding the criteria that you supply it. We can also actually customize all the search result columns. So when we look back at my search here, we have things like category, configuration, type. If I want to add things like the description to the columns or the revision to the columns, it can also help me narrow down the results and find what I'm looking for faster. We can also validate the file without ever opening it. So with a part file, maybe that's not as big of a deal, but when we are looking for maybe an assembly, a larger assembly, that can take longer to open and of course longer to verify. Now, then we also have the file history to help us verify. So we can see who did what, when they did it, what comments they may have made to help narrow down the work that had changed. And that also helps us prevent the duplication of files because we're not creating all these copies. People are going to be less inclined to make a copy of the file for their new concept design. We can actually prevent duplication outright in PDM and just not allow duplicate file names anywhere or based on certain file extensions. So what is this costing us? Well, you spend, say, 5 to 10 minutes searching for a single part. On low end, maybe you're doing this twice a day. Maybe you're working on a new design and you're trying to pull in a bunch of parts and you're performing multiple up to 5, 10 searches a day. Well, at just 5 minutes of searching 2 times a day, that actually adds up to 40 hours, over 40 hours in a year per user. So if you have multiple users doing this, that can add up pretty quick in the amount of time lost. So with PDM, we can cut that time easily in half just based on the metadata being searchable. Verifying the file with the preview, all that comes together to find the files we're looking for quicker. Now what about permissions? So with Windows, we have pretty much read, write, or full control, which really just allows you to change permissions on that file or delete said file. And so it's only based on location. We kind of limited in the options provided. In PDM, we have a lot more permissions, right? We have the ability to control files and folders a bit differently, whether we can rename or add files versus folders. We have the same read permissions, delete permissions, but what PDM really brings to the table here is the workflow state permissions. So not only are we controlling where you can do things, we're also controlling when you can make changes in your in-house process. So when we think back to Windows permissions, right, we need to have at least modify, right? If we don't have modify, we can't add files, we can't change files. Well, what happens if, someone opens a file and they're working on it, and, maybe they're just toying around with some ideas and they're making some changes and whoops, they actually key in 200 and save the file. So now that file, I mean, this is a pretty basic shaft, but that file's changed. It's fundamentally changed, and if we make this save, we turn that file latest version into this new iteration. And so this can cause issues. Maybe you notice it right away. Maybe you accidentally even just deleted the feature, and now you have nothing. You essentially deleted the file without deleting the file. So now what does it take to get that back? Well, if you notice it immediately, you might go to IT, say, hey, IT, I deleted this file. Here it is. Can you pull back up and get it for me? No data loss. But how much time is it actually taking you between you discussing it with IT pulling the backup, IT getting the file, getting it over to you, and you verifying that it works in the references, right? We still have to track down the references at that point. Well, in PDM, if we say open a part, this part happens to be released, and the first thing it's going to ask is if I want to check it out. Well, if I don't check it out, which in the release state, we take away the permission to check out files, which doesn't allow you to modify them. And so if I want to make this change to, say, this key height, if I try making changes, it immediately kind of throws up a warning and says, hey, this is a read-only document. You can't make changes. Great. Okay, well then maybe I'll check out the file. So check out my file. Well, checkout is grayed out. And the reason for that behavior is the fact that our file is in a released state. It's currently used in production. We're protecting that file from being changed by the user without going through the proper workflow. And so we have in our PDM workflow a kind of a change, or engineering change process. And so I would need to change the state first and say, okay, we need to adjust the key height. And now that it's out of the release state, now it's back in my work in progress state, I'm able to check it out at this point. So we've prevented the inadvertent change of our file while it's released without, maybe creating your EC form or going through the proper channels to initiate a change. So now I'm able to come in here, modify this, maybe we'll drop it down to 10. And then I can make my change and save it and check in the file. Awesome, we made the change and we're pretty happy about that, but maybe that wasn't the best change, or maybe down the line we realize that this doesn't work in the assembly, but we already kind of initiated it. And that's really where the history also benefits us again, right? So we see the history, we can see this check-in, but what we can also do is we can roll back the file to a previous version. So when I look at this file history here, I'll have to close it because it's going to essentially delete this version. But if I realize at this time that, okay, well, no, Rev B is going to work for us, that adjustment in the key height, that's no good. We actually need to roll this back and remove those changes from our vault. So now we've taken away those extra versions. Now we're back at version B, and version 5 is where that key height is still 7.5 millimeters. So again, I don't need to open it to verify. All that history is maintained. I'm able to retrieve older versions at the click of a button, provided I have the right permissions. There's no oops button, right? We made a change and saved it over, and oops, IT, can you please bail us out? So again, we have limited control with Windows permissions. We cannot prevent users from saving over data if they are able to create data. And so we have the potential for data loss. It can be a lengthy restore process to bring those files back. It could easily be an hour of combined man hours, 2 hours combined man hours just to get a single file back. What if it's not noticed until after your backup retention policy is expired? Now that data is lost and you have to spend the time to recreate it. And how much time would that take? So it all kind of culminates and adds up into being a pretty big cost potential for your company. So with PDM, we get to control the where and the when, right? We have folder permissions just like Windows, not a ton of difference there. But then we also have the workflow permissions, which prevent changes at key points in your company's process. If a change is made that isn't desirable, we can always restore and roll it back pretty much on demand if you have those permissions. So we also don't want people rolling stuff back when they shouldn't. So we do reserve those permissions, and they have their own that we can grant to users. All right, so the other big thing about SOLIDWORKS is maintaining the data, maintaining the references. How many times have you maybe been in your File Explorer and you're just kind of humming along and you're clicking through the folder structure, and you don't even realize that you just click and drag and move a folder into another one. Well, then what happens if that included some standard components used across multiple assemblies? Well, I do have this full grill assembly I want to reopen, and I am getting more than one result here. Let's see. Let's try this guy. Oh no. By moving these files, or maybe renaming files, depending on your users, if they're not using the SOLIDWORKS rename functionality, we end up with lost references. And so now this isn't a huge assembly, 225 components. It's not bad, but I'm missing 5, 6 parts here. And some of them are in sub-assemblies, some of them are assemblies themselves. Ultimately what I have to do here is try to go ultimately browse for them. So what does that come down to? Well, maybe I'll just need to search for these. So I need a support frame. Okay, well, great. Now I'm getting those same huge number of results. I got to go through, validate, verify again, and make sure I'm using the right one. So make my selection, and it looks good. I think I got lucky, but if we extrapolate that out to larger assemblies, maybe there's more files that have gone missing, maybe more time has passed when things would have been renamed. Did things get a little bit harder? Maybe directories have changed, maybe you moved your files to a new server, and very quickly that problem can balloon to a much larger issue. Now in PDM, this worry is almost entirely negated, right? So if I have my assembly, and let's say I'm just going to kind of jump to that same assembly that I had there. When I look at this grill assembly, great part about this is PDM is tracking these references from the moment your assembly is checked in. This information is all stored in a database. And so the great thing about this is, if someone wants to rename this brace corner, for instance, well, I don't even have to know where it is. I go browse to it immediately. Database will jump me to it. And if I want to rename this, to take off that ampersand, looks like we have another part with that same name. Let me just give it maybe a MLC part number, because maybe I like to design with more descriptive names and narrow it down once I'm ready to release my files. So by making that change, the database instantaneously is going to update the references. Now, I haven't refreshed this page yet, so I will click off and click back on it. And what we'll see is it's already made that change, MLC 00156. Just to prove my point, once it's open and we look at our feature tree for that brace corner, we're going to see that it's not actually there. We actually do have that MLC part number. So I'm just going to use the filter tree here. And once I type in MLC, here we see that the part is truly renamed. It's actually in a subassembly of my upper level. So it's one of the things that I know I did when I was a designer. I would give my parts a descriptive name. It's a lot easier to work with that. Maybe I don't want to pull part numbers yet, so I need some intermediate name. And so performing that rename at the end of it is very, very time consuming. And with PDM, that becomes very trivial because it's all tracked by the database. All right, so with PDM, we have SQL in the back end that is maintaining these references for us. We really don't have to give it any thought. And we have that revision and version maintenance that, again, we don't have to put any thought into. We're not making copies of the files. We're not doing any intense tracking manually of what our file was, what state our files were at revision A. And so time spent here just in managing these, it can add up very quick. The cost of maybe mistakes here is also very high. If you send the print for an older revision and that no longer works, now you got to scrap, maybe thousands of parts. Again, that's going to add up quickly to pay off these PDM licenses, and your return on your investment is going to definitely be seen pretty quickly from moving to a Windows-based file system to our SOLIDWORKS PDM solution. So just a quick recap: we're spending our time searching. If we're spending a couple minutes a day searching, that's going to add up to almost a week's worth of time in any given week. I don't know what you pay your employees per hour, but that could easily add up to a PDM license. We also see that permissions, we can prevent these unwanted changes. The time it takes to pull a backup or to remodel or rework some parts, that's going to be very expensive depending on the complexity of your files. And lastly, the file referencing. We have the SQL backend in PDM that's going to maintain file renames, and it's going to prevent you from having to go search and track down those references that were maybe broken along the way, and help you maintain those revisions and the references between versions. So I want to thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate your time today. If there are any questions, please feel free to reach out to us, let us know.